Throughout the history of British archaeology, many discoveries have claimed to reveal who the first people in England really were. First, there was Boxgrove in West Sussex, a shin bone, 2 teeth, buried in an old quarry, dated to around 500,000 years ago. Solid, accepted, printed in every textbook. Then came the flints of Kent. In 1885, a village shopkeeper named Benjamin Harrison began collecting strange, broken stones from the hills near his shop. He called them dawn stones, and said they were older than anything found before. Some of the biggest scientists in Britain agreed with him. Others said he was collecting rubble. That argument was never settled. Some claims went further. In 1855, at a place called Foxhall in Suffolk, a workman digging sand pulled a human jawbone out of a layer far too old to hold one. A doctor bought it from him, then it was carried across the ocean to America and lost. Nobody has seen it since. It can never be tested, never be dated, never be settled again. And still, none of these come close to the strangest claim ever made about English soil. Because a few years later, in that same corner of England, a man began pulling flints out of a layer so old it should be empty. Not empty of people, empty of everything human. For more than 30 years, that claim sat at the center of a scientific war involving geologists, anatomists, and some of the most famous names alive at the time. And the reason is simple. The layer those flints came from is about 2 million years old. If that is correct, it does not just move the arrival of humans in Britain back a little. It does not just rewrite one chapter. It would place people in England before our species existed, before any human relative is known to have left Africa at all. And the man who found them was not a scientist. To understand this story, you first have to understand the ground. In the east of England, there is a strange layer of sand called the Red Crag. It is exactly what it sounds like, a reddish, rusty-colored sand packed with seashells. It formed on the floor of a shallow sea long before the ice ages. Underneath it sits a thin, dark, gritty layer. The diggers called it the stone bed. Bones, black nodules, and broken flint, pressed flat against much older clay. For most of history, nobody thought about it. It was just sand. Brickmakers dug it out to make bricks. Farmers walked over it. Nobody was looking for a miracle there, which is exactly why what happened next was so hard to dismiss. Then, in 1909, a young man in Ipswich started looking. His name was James Reid Moir. He was not a professor. He had no degree in geology. He worked in his family's tailoring shop in Ipswich, selling clothes, and he hated it. He did not get on with his father. He did not want the family business. What he wanted was flint. It started, the story goes, with a single arrowhead he picked up on a heath near town. That was all it took. From then on, Moore spent every free hour walking pits, quarries, and brickfields, turning stones over in his hands. And on the 3rd of October 1909, at a brickfield on Dales Road, he found something that would follow him for the rest of his life. It was sitting on a heap of stones the workmen had thrown aside. A single flint, weighing almost 9 pounds. Heavy enough to need both hands, and along one end flaked down to a working edge, a proper edge, the kind that cuts. It was stained deep yellow-brown, the color flint turns only after it has been buried for an unimaginably long time. Moore did not stop there. He went into the pits himself, dug down through the sand to the bottom, and there on the old clay he found more. Flakes, heavy-shaped pieces, some with edges, some with careful, repeated work along one side. He was a tailor. And he had just found something that, if it was real, made him the most important man in British archaeology. He worked carefully. That part matters. Moir recorded where each piece came from, which layer it sat in, how deep it lay. He did not pick things off the surface and guess but. He followed the layers with his own hands, and later he did something a hobbyist did not have to do. He brought in a trained geologist to check him. So the digging was not sloppy. The positions were real, which left only one problem: the age. Here is what the ground says. Modern science dates the Red Crag to between about 2.4 and 3.2 million years old, one of the oldest layers of its kind in Britain. And Moir's flints were not in the Red Crag. They were underneath it. Which means, if they are tools, someone stood on that clay before the sea came in and buried it, before 2 million years of history began stacking up on top. To see how impossible that sounds, look at where humans actually were. 2 million years ago, our family tree was small, and it was African. Homo habilis was alive, early Homo erectus was appearing, both in Africa. To be fair, making stone tools was never something only our own species could do. Other human relatives made and used them too, but none of them, on every piece of evidence we have, had reached Britain. The oldest confirmed human relatives found anywhere outside Africa come from Dmanisi, in Georgia, about 1.8 million years ago. 5 skulls, thousands of stone tools. That is the far edge of the map. And getting to England was never the impossible part. 2 million years ago, Britain was not an island. A ridge of chalk ran across what is now the Channel, joining England to Europe, and it held until huge floods tore it apart hundreds of thousands of years later. You could have walked to Suffolk. The road was open, the travelers are missing. Someone believed him anyway. And not just anyone. In May of 1910, Moir wrote to Sir Edwin Ray Lancaster, a former director of the Natural History Museum in London, and a man whose opinion could open every door in the country. Lancaster came to Ipswich. He looked at the flints. He looked at the pits, and he was convinced. He gave the strange beaked stones a name of his own, and in 1914 published a full scientific paper on one of them. Then Moir went public. On the 17th of October 1910, he wrote to the Times of London, and they printed it, right beside a letter about changes to the church prayer book. Ordinary newspaper, ordinary readers, and buried in the middle of it the claim that people were living in England before that sea laid down the crag. He argued something bolder still. These were not the clumsy first attempts of beginners. Whoever made them already knew exactly what they were doing, which meant somebody had been doing it for a very long time before that. And here is the part that surprises most people. The establishment did not laugh at him. They agreed with him. Sir Arthur Keith, the most famous anatomist in Britain, took the finds seriously and wrote about them. Henry Fairfield Osborn, head of the American Museum of Natural History, crossed the Atlantic to stand in a Suffolk field and look at the ground himself. Even Henri Breuil, a French expert famous for tearing apart claims exactly like this one, accepted some of Moir's material. And in 1923, Moir published a joint report with a professional geologist named Boswell, laying the geology out layer by layer. Remember that name, Boswell. By 1929, the president of the local prehistoric society could stand up and say that every leading authority who had studied those deposits in person had backed Reid Moir. The tailor from Ipswich had won. He became president of Ipswich Museum, taking the seat once held by Lancaster himself. And in 1937, James Reid Moir, a shopkeeper with no scientific training, was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society, the highest scientific honor in Britain. He had climbed higher than anyone in his position had any right to climb. And then the ground gave way beneath him. The doubts had always been there, quietly, in the background, and they came down to one simple, uncomfortable question. How do you know a stone was shaped by a person and not by nature? Because flint breaks. It breaks when it is crushed. It breaks when ice drags it. It breaks when the ground shifts, when frost splits it, when a sea rolls it against other stones for 100,000 years. And when flint breaks, it breaks in sharp, curved, clean flakes, which is the whole reason our ancestors chose it. A man named Samuel Hazeldine Warren decided to test it properly. Warren did not argue with words. He took ordinary flints, put them in a screw press, and applied slow crushing pressure. The same pressure deep ground puts on stone over long ages. He did it in front of live audiences in London. And the flints came out the other side looking like tools. Flaked edges, worked surfaces, shapes you would swear a hand had made. Warren even found a place where nature was turning them out by itself, over and over, with nobody anywhere near it. He called it a natural factory. Suddenly there were 2 explanations for everything Moir had ever found, and only one of them needed a person. Then came the betrayal. Boswell was the geologist who had stood beside Moir in 1923. His name was on that report. His training was the reason the geology had been taken seriously at all. In 1935, Boswell publicly turned against it. He went back over the ground and took apart the geology he had once helped confirm. The man who made the case credible became the man who broke it. And Moir kept going. He never stepped back from a single claim. 2 experts, the same layers, the same flints, and no agreement between them at all. For years it stayed like that. Both sides could hold up the same stone and see 2 different worlds. Then, in 1939, an American researcher named Alfred Barnes did something nobody had done before. He stopped arguing about how the flints looked and started measuring them. Barnes focused on one detail. When a flake breaks off a stone, it leaves a scar. Between that scar and the surface it was struck from, there is an angle. That angle can be measured on any flake by anyone. Here is what makes it powerful. A person striking a stone on purpose has to control that angle. There is no choice about it. Hit outside a certain range, and the stone simply will not flake the way you want. So human work leaves angles that cluster tightly, again and again, because they have to. Nature has no such limit. Ice, pressure, and collapse do not aim. Their angles scatter across the whole range, and a large share come out too wide to be useful to anybody. So the test was simple. If these were tools, the angles should sit in a narrow band. If they were accidents, they should be spread out and wide. Barnes measured the dawn stones. The angles were spread out and wide. Not one collection passed. That was the moment. Not a shouting match, not a rival opinion. A number, measured the same way for everyone, that did not care whose reputation was attached to it. The evidence had stopped being a story and become a measurement, and the measurement said no. There was one more thing working against him, and it had nothing to do with flint. In 1912, in a gravel pit in Sussex, pieces of a skull were announced to the world as the earliest Englishman, Piltdown Man. For 40 years it sat in the textbooks, and in 1953 it was proven to be a forgery, a human skull joined to an ape's jaw, stained to look ancient. Moir had nothing to do with making it, but the two had leaned on each other for decades. Crude flints from Piltdown were used to argue the skull was real, and the skull was used to argue the flints were real, and underneath both was something nobody liked to say out loud. Britain wanted an early Englishman. In France, claims like this were treated with suspicion. In England, they were welcomed. When Piltdown fell, it did not fall alone. James Reid Moir died on the 24th of February, 1944, aged 64, 9 years before that fraud was exposed. He never saw it. He died still holding the honor, still believing in what he had spent his life digging for. Within a generation, the flints he built that life on were quietly reclassified as stones broken by nature. So the 2 million years is gone. No serious researcher today argues that anyone was living in Britain 1 million years ago, let alone 2. Moir was wrong about the date. He was wrong about the flints. He was not wrong about the place. Because the 2 oldest traces of human activity in all of northern Europe were both found in East Anglia. In the same 2 counties Moir spent his whole life walking. In 2005, at Pakefield on the Suffolk coast, researchers found 32 worked flints in an ancient riverbed dated to around 700,000 years ago. Then in 2010, at Happisburgh in Norfolk, 78 stone tools, buried in the mud of a lost river, dated to between 800,000 and 950,000 years old. And in May of 2013, on that same beach, low tide pulled back the sand and revealed hollows pressed into ancient mud. Footprints. Around 49 of them. About 12 clear enough to be certain. Roughly 5 people, adults and children, walking together across an estuary somewhere between 800,000 and 1 million years ago, the oldest human footprints ever found outside Africa. Researchers photographed them from every angle they could, working against the clock, because the prints lay below the high tide line. Within 2 weeks, the sea erased them completely. They exist now only as photographs. The real footprints of the oldest known people in Britain waited almost 1 million years, stayed visible for a matter of days, and then they were gone. Today, more than a century after a tailor picked a heavy flint off a heap of stones in Ipswich, his collection is still there. Thousands of pieces, in museum drawers, carefully labeled, still available to study. They are kept on purpose. Not as treasures, but as tests. Because telling a real tool from a stone broken by nature is still one of the hardest problems in archaeology. Whether some future method finds something in them nobody has seen yet, or whether they stay exactly what they appear to be, only time will tell. But somewhere between the flints that fooled a generation and the footprints the sea took back, there is a version of this story we still do not have, and there is a great deal of England that has never been dug. If you want more stories like this one, there is more waiting for you here.